Woodward was a character. He was flamboyant. He wore monstrous piles of lace, but it was always filthy. And he had grandiose schemes. I mean, I'm sure you've talked to folks before about his plan for the city of Detroit to rival the greatest of Parisian parks. And yet at the same time, he could not manage the city at all.
That's the voice of Barchaelogist, author, and Hamtramckan Mickey Lyons. And today's episode of your Daily Detroit for Friday, December 11th, 2020, well, I'd like to think it's as if you're joining me at the bar for a conversation with the keeper of some of Detroit's best stories. And after all, history can help be a guide to what's happening now. And at the end of the show, we have a giveaway for our members and supporters, which I am excited about. So let's just get started, shall we? Mickey Lyons, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Good to talk to you, Jer.
So I want to talk to you, and let's start with the Barchaelogist part first, because we're dealing with this pandemic. We're dealing with restrictions. We're dealing with closures. None of this is new. And some of the reactions, well, they're not new either if you open up a history book.
Right. As part of my ongoing research into Detroit's drinking history, I've really found that, just as with many other industries, there's not a whole lot that's new under the sun. So I would say since as long as Michigan has been a state, the conservatives in the Michigan legislature have been trying to rein in some of Detroit's excesses, shall we say.
So the city of Detroit has been a target over time. So nowadays it's kind of the pandemic situation, but in the past it's us Detroiters, with us saloonimals.
Right. I like that. As with, I would say, there's some similarities to New York State. You've got, a rural state versus the big city. There are definitely some butting of heads and some attempts to legislate away some of the activities that Detroiters are conducting. So all the way going back to even before Detroit was officially a city, back when it was first settled, there was sort of this unwritten but definitely agreed upon rule that, certain people were not to be sold alcohol to. And good old Hamtramckan himself, Joseph Campo, broke that rule, and he sold alcohol to the Native Americans in the area and earned himself quite the boycott for it.
Oh.
It didn't do him too much damage, though. He died the richest man in Michigan.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, worth millions.
Wow, it's like our own little former Bruce Wayne, if you will.
Right, only a little bit more wicked.
Yeah, a little bit more wicked. Well, and that's one of the things, too, is that a lot of people in Detroit's history, and I was going to talk about this at the end, and I will again, but a lot of Detroiters, there's kind of like a little bit of a wicked turn, and you get into it in one of your books called Wicked Detroit.
Yeah, that was a fun one. I took basically 10 historical figures in Detroit and it devoted a chapter to each one of them. And fortunately, of course, with my love of old bars and bar history, 2 of them were bar owners too.
Well, color me surprised, right?
Right? It's on brand, Jer. It's on brand.
Well, and I remember having a chat with you offline about things around the pandemic and like some of the resistance to masks. Like that's a century old too.
Oh, absolutely. We're starting to see more historical focus on the similarities between public responses during the Spanish flu epidemic and this particular one that we're in right now. And, the anti-maskers remain the same. The folks that defy orders and go, 102 years ago, there were shutdowns of restaurants and of movie theaters as well. And people staged protests and sit-ins. So, it's happening again. And you just, I don't know if I should be encouraged or discouraged that human behavior doesn't change all that much.
I think a lot of people who don't look at history, they get surprised by these things, but there are patterns to just like kind of how the larger group of humans works, regardless of technology or how they're connected or all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, whether the way you're getting your news is via Facebook or Twitter or the newspaper, it's still easy enough to spread information and disinformation out there.
Conspiracy theories are nothing new.
Right. That's quite true. And clickbait isn't all that new either.
No, I mean, I think some of us who've seen old newspaper headlines have seen some pretty crazy ones.
Yeah, absolutely. The same tactics are used to get people to buy the paper or click the article.
Yeah, I mean, people forget. I mean, a number of our listeners, and this is kind of, as somebody who's like in that middle ground of extremely old millennial, but I know talking to a number of our listeners who have never read a newspaper before and never even like encountered a news box.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that breaks the recovering journalist in me, my little heart there.
Right, but like some of the same principles applied where you had to really like get people or carnival bark people into buying your paper. I think about one of the old papers, the Detroit Times, really did a lot of that kind of stuff, and it makes me think too, like all the crafty ways that people try to get around restrictions. I know that like this isn't in Michigan, but you mentioned that New York State had a way that bar owners had to use to get around some restrictions in yesteryear.
So this is one of my favorite stories from Prohibition, and I found some evidence of it in Michigan. It's called the Raines Sandwich, Raines, or also known as the Prohibition Sandwich. So speaking of old is new again, these are starting to crop up in New York City because of a regulation that was passed there that said you can't serve drinks unless you serve food as well, or unless I think a certain percentage of your income has to come from food sales. We've toyed with that idea here in Michigan as well. And of course, bar owners being bar owners during, before, and after Prohibition, they're going to get around it. In fact, I found an article from 1909 when Michigan, in one of its series of attempts to change our drinking habits here in Detroit, there was an anti-free lunch law that was passed. So basically, it made it a misdemeanor to serve free lunch with drinks. And it limited it to crackers and pretzels. And this Free Press article from 1909 says, but it is safe to forecast that various methods will be found to get around this restriction. And of course there were. And one of the things that they did in New York is they had a Raines sandwich, which was essentially one sandwich for the whole bar that lasted about a week.
Ew.
Basically, you ordered your lunch and it was the sandwich and a whiskey. And they brought the sandwich out to you and handed you your drink and then took the sandwich to somebody else.
Wow.
It's the same sandwich. There was actually, I found an account of a bar fight at one point because someone had the audacity to actually eat the sandwich. And that was just not cool.
I mean, that also sounds like, why would you want to eat that sandwich?
I know. I'm thinking this was kind of the case of a country bumpkin in the city, not knowing that this was how it worked.
Oh, yes, those unwritten rules. Well, one of the things that you talk about a lot in your writing, whether it's through books, through your website, things like that, is the state of dive bars and heritage bars. Through all of this, do you kind of have an idea of how they're doing? I mean, there's so much coverage about the new and the fancy, but like these places are just pillars of the Detroit community in so many ways. Do you kind of have an idea how they're doing or how people can support them?
Well, the bad news is dive bars and family bars, neighborhood bars, heritage bars, whatever you want to call them. I know some folks don't love being called a dive bar just because they're old. But these heritage bars, if you will, are just closed. They just don't have, if they don't have the food capacity, if they don't have the fire code capacity, they just aren't able to be open right now. But the good news for many of them that sets them apart a little bit is that quite a few of them own the buildings. So they're not having to worry about rent and overhead because they've owned the building free and clear for 50, 100 years. It's not to say they're not hurting because there's zero income and you still have to keep the electricity going. But, fortunately, I think the oldest of our good old family-owned bars are going to continue to be okay. And as for how to help them out, buy stuff from them. If they're selling, go buy a thing, tip the heck out of them, gift certificates if they have them, or just make sure you're keeping them in mind for when we all open back up again.
Right. Moving from heritage bars to kind of today, there are a lot of producers that, frankly, in Michigan, it's kind of like a weedy mess of regulations. We've had a number of people on over the years, and then nationally, there's a whole layer of regulations.
Yeah.
Like it is just like one thing after another for these smaller producers. And one of the things that you sent me to talk about, and I'm glad to talk about it, is about stopping craft tax increases. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So all the way back in 2017, Congress passed an act called, and I had to look it up because I had to write it down because it's not a good acronym, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act.
CMBTR or something.
Yes.
Scimitar.
So the Craft Beverage Act, basically. It said at that time for 2 years that any brewery that was under a certain number of barrels produced per year, so essentially anything other than the big dogs, the Millers, the Anheisers, those had their excises decreased by 50%. And smaller distilleries, just like, your Valentine's, your Detroit City distilleries, those ones had their taxes reduced as well. Now, Congress passed an extension of it last year at the 11th hour, so that it was extended for 1 year. It's set to expire again on December 31st of this year. And if it doesn't pass, if it doesn't go through, if Congress doesn't vote on it, which they've been tending to do lately, for distillers, we're looking at a 400% increase in the excises that they pay.
Ooh.
And for breweries, it's going to be, I think, 100% increase. You want to talk about when smaller businesses are going to be going under, that's the kind of thing that just sinks you. You can't stand a 400% increase.
I understand that there's various quote unquote sin taxes done on various things that people enjoy. But it really seems like when it comes to this small producer revolution, it almost seems like punitive to keep trying and putting this at the trough, make it a year-long extension. Like, that just seems kind of cruel to me. If you're going to do this, why not make it permanent? And then the other thing to think about is there's so much lobbying that goes on, especially with the big producers.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big producers would probably love to see this go away because their sales are getting cut into by all of the smaller hometown distillers and brewers as well. And I talked to Robin at Norden Aquavit last year and JP at Detroit City Distillery too, and they both said if this doesn't go through, they'd have to cut staff. There's just no way around it. So that's more joblessness. That some businesses aren't going to survive this kind of thing. So, at a time when unemployment is so high to begin with in the industry, this is one thing that hopefully we can do to just put our finger in the dike just for a few more months.
This is a personal aside, but it seems kind of crazy that we're working really hard to collect more taxes from, like Robin from Norden has been on the show before. This is not a huge operation, but we're working super hard to collect more taxes from him. But Jeff Bezos, we're good.
Yeah, exactly. He can have free reign, of the city, including its historic buildings. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a whole nother issue up there in the state fairground, right?
Right.
Yeah, if people don't know that Amazon development, one hook on it is that a number of historic fairgrounds buildings are in line to be demolished. They did save the Grant House, and that's moving to Eastern Market. As we've reported, we did a whole episode on it. But there's a whole assortment of buildings up there over by what has been for a long time the Stonehouse Bar.
Yeah, you heard it here first. There have been some rumblings that the Stonehouse may yet rise again.
Really?
Yes.
It's like the phoenix that kind of stumbles around. And it's like the stumbly phoenix.
Once upon a time, there was certainly some under-the-radar liquor sales going on at that place, so...
I do want to circle back to the book as promised, and I don't want to tip the hand on all of these different characters, but I wanted to talk for one quick second about a specific one, and only because it's the name everybody will know because they've driven down the road, and that's Augustus Woodward. And I think it's funny that we've given our biggest street that everybody talks about to a man that you describe as brilliant incompetent.
Yes, he truly was. I mean, Woodward was a character. He was flamboyant. He wore monstrous piles of lace, but it was always filthy. And he had grandiose schemes. I mean, I'm sure you've talked to folks before about his plan for the city of Detroit to rival the greatest of Parisian parks. And yet at the same time, he could not manage the city at all. He showed up as the judge right after the Great Fire of 1805. And he managed to spend all of his time in Detroit fighting with his rival to the extent that the citizens of the city sent letters to Congress saying, please get rid of this guy. He's useless.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, he was brilliant. His mind, his legal mind was influential and genius. But as far as any sort of practical applications, he was a spectacularly bad manager of the city.
Yeah, and he got into a whole bunch of different business outshoots, and people talk about land speculation today. He did that back at the turn of, 1805, 1810s. Land speculation's been a problem here for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. And to the extent that he was in charge of laying out the city streets after the fire, since the fire destroyed everything, they had a fresh start. So he just happened to lay out the entire city so that his parcel of land was the best part of it.
Are you serious?
Basically, all roads led to Woodward's mansion, essentially, yeah.
Oh my gosh. So where was his mansion?
It was at the foot of Woodward, just about.
Okay.
Maybe now that's further in now than it was before, because we filled in.
Right. So where about did we fill in, from Woodward? Because if you go downtown today, it's different than it was back in those times.
Right. So I think it's just about at Larned on the corner. There's a historical marker on Woodward. I think it's at Larned.
Okay.
That says this was the landing site of Cadillac. And they're pretty sure that was accurate. So everything past that ended up being filled in.
Wow. Well, and then the original fort, I think, was at Fort and Shelby or so.
Correct. Yeah, where that Comerica Bank is right now.
Yeah.
That was the highest point in the city.
Wow. Yeah, you know what? If you think about it, that's right. And if you think about that slope that goes down into the riverfront from there, and the wind just picks up. It's one of the things I've noticed. I know it's a completely ridiculous thing.
Yeah.
But right about that point on, it is always colder.
Yeah. So one other note that I go into in the book, because I talk about General Hull, who was the general during the War of 1812, is that Woodward did not do such a great job of laying out the city and the fort, in that the fort was directly on top of most of the population of the city. So that slope down basically would have been where all the people's houses were. So that essentially, if you were trying to shoot the cannons across the river, say to defend Detroit during an invasion, you ran the risk of actually shooting your own citizens with the cannon fire.
Oops.
So, yeah. Good job, Woodward.
Oh, my. Well, that's one of the things is people like to point to whatever most recent mayor that did something terrible and then be and wag their finger, or they go back and, you can debate Coleman Young back and forth and things like that. But frankly, Detroit incompetence has a long history.
Oh, spectacularly. Yeah. From the very beginning, Cadillac did a tremendous job grafting his way through both Detroit and Louisiana.
Well, and I think part of it is people today forget that it was a frontier town.
Oh, 100%. It's one of the oldest towns west of the Alleghenies. We have the second oldest church continuously operating.
Well, yeah. And then we have the multiple countries that we have lived under. We're founded by the French. There was a short period with the British and then America. And then I think that founding by the French gives us a little bit of a shared energy, a little bit different way of it, but shared energy with places like New Orleans.
Absolutely. I love, back when we could travel, I was always down in New Orleans at least twice a year. Tried to get there 3-4 times a year when I could. And there are so many similarities between the people and the cultures of Detroit and New Orleans. Yeah. And has a lot to do with the fact that Cadillac had a big hand in both of them, I think.
Oh, really? Cadillac had a hand down there too, huh?
Yeah, he got kicked out of New Orleans as well.
Kicked out of 2 cities.
Kicked out of two of the best cities. Kicked him out. Yeah. There is some evidence to support the idea that Cadillac was a pirate.
What?
So I think it would be pretty cool to say that Detroit was founded by a pirate. There's a few years that we don't have a whole lot of information on. We know he was a ship's captain along the northeastern coast up in Montreal in Canada, and that he came back with a lot of money. So he was either embezzling or smuggling or possibly a pirate.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's something new. I did not know that. I'm stunned. I feel like I learned every time I talk to you, Mickey, I learn something new. 100%.
Well, good. I'm always learning too. So
Well, one thing I wanted to tell listeners about is this book, Wicked Detroit. We mentioned a little bit of it. There's something cool for our Patreon members who support this show, and that's thanks to your very kind gift. And that is that we are going to be giving away to our members who, we'll take a look. We'll do the giveaway on the 15th. Anyone who's a member at patreon.com/dailydetroit, we're going to raffle, and then somebody is going to get a copy of Wicked Detroit courtesy of you. And in fact, it's signed.
It's signed and everything, yes, with my very own hand. Nestily, I believe. Yeah.
You had no multinational corporation to do all the signings for you?
Yeah, with the post office delays, my automated signature machine is still in the mail.
Well, Mickey Lyons, where can people find more about you, follow you, support your work, buy all your things?
I've got a website and Facebook page, and that is Prohibition Detroit. So prohibitiondetroit.com, Prohibition Detroit on Facebook, and Prohibition Detroit at Gmail, actually, too. So I'm also working on a couple new projects for Detroit Drinks History, which is expanding it a little bit past and around Prohibition. So more on that soon.
Mickey Lyons, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jer.
Thanks to Cheyenne Noserini and Randy Walker behind the scenes. Fletcher Sharp as well for being on this week. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to share the show with a friend. It's the best way to push Metro Detroit's conversation forward. In coming attractions, we go behind the scenes of a new project located on a long vacant parcel of land in Detroit's Midtown. And a local futurist shares what the world will look like past the pandemic based on some fascinating new research. With that, I'm J.R. Stays. Thanks so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. Take care of each other, and we'll get through this together.